It'll cost $300,000 to fix. The female CEO said a single dad solved it with a $9 part Priscilla. And Nkemelu had exactly 11 days to save the Fairmont plant, and every consultant she brought in had told her the same thing. It couldn't be done in 11 days. It couldn't be done in 11 weeks. The hydraulic press that anchored Line 3, the single most important machine in 140,000 square foot facility, had gone down 4 days ago, and the two engineering firms she'd flown in from Chicago and Detroit had both delivered the same verdict, with the same grim, apologetic certainty. The main cylinders compromised. The Detroit firm's lead engineer had told her, standing in front of a machine that looked, to Priscilla's eyes, no different than it had a week ago. Internal seal failures caused pressure loss throughout the whole hydraulic circuit. At this age, you're not looking at a repair. You're looking at a full replacement. The press itself, the pump assembly, probably half the plumbing. Call it 300,000. And that's if nothing else turns up once we're inside it. Priscilla was 36 years old, the youngest CEO in Halverson Industrial's 40-year history. And she had inherited the Fairmont plant 18 months ago as part of a company-wide restructuring that half the board had quietly opposed. Everyone was watching to see whether she could actually run a manufacturing operation, or whether she was, as one retiring board member had put it in a meeting he didn't realize she'd overheard, a spreadsheet person wearing a hard hat for the photo op. She had spent 18 months proving that assumption wrong, plant by plant, line by line. Fairmont was the one that mattered most, the oldest facility in the company's portfolio. The one with the most institutional memory, the one where Halverson Industrial's founder had personally welded the first support beam in 1974. $300,000 wasn't the kind of money that would sink the company. But 11 days was the deadline on a contract with Meridian Auto, a supply agreement worth $11 million annually, contingent on Fairmont proving it could deliver its first order on time. Missed the deadline, and Meridian's VP of procurement had made it very clear the contract would go to a competitor in Ohio instead. 140 jobs at the plant depended on that contract. Priscilla had done the math more times than she wanted to admit, and every version of it ended the same way. Without Line 3 running, Fairmont didn't just lose a client. It started the slow, familiar death that had already claimed 3 other plants like it across the Midwest in the last decade. She was standing in front of the dead press for the 4th time that week, arms crossed, jaw set, running numbers in her head that refused to add up in any direction that didn't hurt. When the plant's floor supervisor, Ruth Alvarez, found her, "There is someone you should talk to," Ruth said, "before you sign off on the Detroit firm's quote." "I've talked to everyone, Ruth." 2 engineering firms, both saying the same thing. "Not everyone." Ruth glanced back toward the far end of the shop floor, where a man in gray coveralls was crouched beside a different machine entirely, a wrench in one hand, a coffee thermos balanced on his knee. His name patch, half worn from years of laundering, read D. Reyes. "Daniel's worked maintenance here for 11 years. Started right out of the Army. He's the one who kept that press limping along for the last 3 years. On parts nobody makes anymore. Because corporate wouldn't approve a proper overhaul budget. If anybody actually knows that machine's guts, it's him, not 2 guys who flew in Tuesday and never touched it before Wednesday." Priscilla studied Daniel Reyes across the length of the shop floor. He didn't look like he was trying to be noticed. He was focused entirely on the machine in front of him, working with the unhurried precision of someone who'd done this exact motion 10,000 times. Why hasn't anyone mentioned him before now? Ruth's expression flickered, something careful and a little sad crossing it. Because nobody asks the maintenance guys before they call the consultants. That's just how it goes. Usually. Daniel Reyes was 42 years old and had been raising his son, Eli, alone for 6 years, since his wife's death from an aneurysm that had given no warning at all one ordinary Tuesday, and then nothing was ordinary again. He'd built his entire routine at Fairmont around Eli's school schedule, trading shifts, turning down promotions to a supervisor role twice, because it would have meant longer hours and less time to be the one who picked Eli up, made dinner, checked homework. He was good at his job in a way that rarely got acknowledged in performance reviews, because the nature of maintenance work meant that doing it well Mostly looked like nothing going wrong in visible labor, noticed only in its absence. He'd watched Line 3's press degrade slowly over 3 years, filing report after report requesting a proper overhaul budget. Watching those requests get deprioritized year after year in favor of numbers that looked better on a different kind of spreadsheet. He wasn't surprised the machine had finally failed. He was, in a quiet, tired way, almost relieved, because now, maybe someone would actually have to look at it properly, instead of asking him to keep patching a problem that needed real investment. What he didn't expect was for the plant's CEO to walk over to his workstation personally and crouch down next to him. "Ruth tells me you know this press better than anyone," Priscilla said. "I've got 2 firms telling me it needs a $300,000 replacement. I'd like your opinion before I sign anything." Daniel wiped his hands on a rag, studying her for a second, not with suspicion. Exactly, more like a man recalibrating an assumption he'd carried for a long time about whoever asked his opinion on anything. "You want the honest answer, or the answer that doesn't step on 2 consulting firms' invoices. The honest one, always the honest one." He set down his wrench. "Then let's go look at it. Properly. Not the way they looked at it." It took him 40 minutes with the press disassembled at the specific joint he'd been worried about for over a year, tracing hydraulic lines with a flashlight and a patience that made the 2 consultants' earlier inspection look, in hindsight, almost careless. "Here," Daniel said finally, holding up a small component between 2 fingers, a pressure relief valve, no larger than a spark plug. Its seat visibly cracked. "This is your problem, not the main cylinder, not the pump assembly. This valve's been slowly failing for months. I flagged it in a maintenance report back in March, actually, asking for it to be replaced before it went. When it finally gave, it let the whole system lose pressure fast enough that anyone testing the cylinder afterward would see symptoms that look exactly like internal seal failure, because functionally, in that moment, they are failing just not for the reason they think." Priscilla frowned, turning the small part over. "You're telling me a $9 valve caused a $300,000 diagnosis. I'm telling you the diagnosis was based on symptoms, not on tracing the actual fault back to its source," Daniel said. 2 firms came in, saw pressure loss and cylinder behavior consistent with a major failure, and quoted you for the worst-case scenario, because that's the safe, defensible number to put in a report. Nobody wants to be the guy who says cheap fix and gets it wrong. I don't have that problem, because I've had my hands inside this exact machine for 3 years. I know what it sounds like when it's actually dying. This isn't that. And if you're wrong, then you're out the cost of a valve and a day of testing," Daniel said. "Instead of $300,000 and however many weeks it takes to source, ship, and install an entire new press. Seems like a bet worth making before you write that check." Priscilla authorized the test. Daniel replaced the valve himself that afternoon, a part he sourced from a local hydraulic supplier for $9.11. A component so unremarkable that neither consulting firm's report had even mentioned checking it, because both firms had approached the problem from the assumption that a machine this old, failing this dramatically, had to be dying at its core rather than choking on something small. The press came back online at 4:40 that afternoon, running within factory spec on the first test cycle, and again on the second, and again on every cycle after that. For the rest of the week, Priscilla stood in front of the machine long after the rest of the floor had gone quiet for the shift change, running the numbers again, not because they were hard this time, but because she wanted to make sure she'd actually understood them correctly. $300,000 versus $9.11. 11 days of dread, solved in a single afternoon by a man who'd been filing accurate. Ignored maintenance reports for months. "Why didn't anyone listen to your report sooner?" she asked him, when he came to check the machine's readings, one final time before heading home to LI. Daniel considered the question honestly, instead of diplomatically, which she appreciated more than she expected to, because maintenance reports don't come with a PowerPoint deck. Consultants show up in suits with slides and confidence, and people trust that more than a guy in coveralls who's been saying the same thing quietly for a year. I'm not saying that to complain, it's just how it usually works. I stopped expecting different a while ago. Priscilla didn't say anything for a moment, Then, "It's going to work differently here now." She meant it, and she followed through in a way that mattered more than a single afternoon of gratitude. Within a month, Priscilla had restructured Fairmont's maintenance department's reporting line so that flagged issues went directly to plant leadership rather than getting filtered through layers of budget approval that had, for years, buried exactly the kind of warning Daniel had raised back in March. She created a new role, Senior Reliability Technician, built specifically around Daniel's actual expertise, with a salary that finally reflected what his knowledge had been worth to the plant for over a decade, and enough scheduling flexibility that he never had to choose between Eli's school pickup and his job again. Meridian Auto's contract closed on time, on day 10, with a full day to spare. The account executive who signed it never knew how close it had come to falling apart, or that the difference between an $11 million annual contract and a plant staring down its own decline had come down to a $9 valve that a maintenance report had flagged 5 months earlier, unread. Daniel Reyes visited the plant once that spring, on a day his school was closed for teacher conferences, and Priscilla happened to be walking the floor when she saw him 9 years old, sitting on a stool beside his father's workstation, watching Daniel explain the inner workings of a hydraulic system with the same patient precision he brought to everything. "Is Dad the boss now?" Eli asked her, with the blunt curiosity only a child manages. "Not exactly," Priscilla said, crouching slightly to his level. "But he's the person everyone comes to first now when something's actually broken. That matters more than most titles do." Daniel, overhearing, gave her a look that wasn't quite a smile, but carried the same weight as one. The old hydraulic press is still the anchor of Line 3, still running on the original main cylinder that 2 engineering firms once swore was compromised beyond repair. It gets maintained now, the way Daniel always argued it should be, proactively, on a schedule built around his reports instead of around budget cycles that treated warnings as optional. Priscilla keeps the $9 valve in a small case on her office shelf, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of a lesson she's carried into every plant she's walked into since. The most expensive mistake a company can make usually isn't a mechanical one. It's failing to listen to the person who's had their hands on the actual problem the whole time, simply because he never came dressed like he expected to be heard. The end.